legalizefreedom.com.
Hello once again, Thomas. It's great to have you join us back on Legalized Freedom channel again. We decided to do video today because, well, we just did. We're going to be talking about, as viewers will have seen from the graphics and the title, looking back to your book, The Anvil of the Psyche, published quite a few years ago, and just really reflecting on what's changed in the meantime, or what hasn't, you know. The story behind the idea behind this was quite interesting, wasn't it? Because you and I were at the Mysterious Earth conference, Neil McDonald's thing, back in September. And Neil, wasn't it Neil, who had been sent 3 mint copies of your book, The Anvil of the Psyche, with instructions that one of them should be given to me.
Yep.
And I don't know who this person was, somebody from Liverpool apparently. So if you're watching this, you know who you are. Like, thanks very much. I of course bought the book when it came out. I should just say that there was, I don't know how many you ended up printing originally, but it's never been back in print. So it's now not difficult to find, but the people who are selling copies are looking for a lot of money for it. This is why you've made it available for free at your Substack. And it's only a little book, you know, it's not like massively, you know, extensive or anything, but it's demand outstrips supply, shall we say. So the last time I looked, there was a copy selling for 130 quid, and that was yesterday. So long story short, I've got my own copy. So what we're going to do, we might as well do it right now, actually. I've got this copy that was gifted to me by this chap or lady from Liverpool, and I'm going to give that away to a viewer. So all folks need to do, quite simply, is drop an email to legalizefreedom@yahoo.com. Just legalize with an S, freedom@yahoo.com. You don't even have to bother with an actual email as such. Just put Anvil of the Psyche or Thomas Sheridan, anything you want in the subject line, and then randomly, after this goes out on January the 1st, I'll give it a week or so, and I'll just randomly choose someone and mail the book off to them, and I hope they enjoy it. Because as much as, you know, the digital world allow these things to become available in millions and millions of copies, you know, you can take one PDF, can't you, and send it to 1 million people. There's something really nice about physical media, which is another thing that we've been talking about a great deal recently, isn't it? So, but yeah, I would say, as a way of opening things up, I reread the book in preparation for this, and Ahead of Its Time sounds a bit cheesy, a bit of a cliche, but it's really very much a book for now.
Yeah, it's first of all, the mint copy is a signed mint copy, so I also signed it as well. Yeah, that book is really a collection of essays of stuff that was going through my mind, or stuff I had collated for 2 previous books I'd written, Puzzling People and Defeated Demons, and I didn't really feel that these essays could really be dovetailed into either one of those books. They might have been a bit too esoteric or too conspiratorial for the audience that was aimed at, especially the first book. So it was actually a very good time for me when I wrote that book. It was like I was able to get out a lot of the sort of esoteric stuff that I kind of bottled up inside me for years, you know, officially in a little book. And I was quite happy how it came out. It's ultimately, I guess, about mind control, the book, but it touches on a few other things that are kind of relevant to how people end up and societies end up mind controlled. And it touches on everything from, like, you know, 20th century psychology to mind control to pop culture to how things are played off against people's minds to give them associations with things they wouldn't normally be associated with, but needed. Yeah, I guess when Matthias Desmond's books on mass formation came out in the recent years and have gotten justifiably all this attention, I think I, in a kind of a limited way, was hitting at these topics back in 2012 at the Anvil of the Psyche.
Yeah, very much so. And it's interesting. I remember when we did our People Can Find at legalizefreedom.com, our original interview around the Anvil, the Psyche. It's in two parts because we spoke for a long time. I do have a memory of, while I was reading the book, of going to a major train station at one point. You know, I had the book with me, and I started to notice things. I think I was aware of this, 24/7 mass media matrix that we're all immersed in, because you and I, given that the age that we are, we've lived through really media going from seemingly to be everywhere, in the 70s and 80s to more or less actually being everywhere today. So I was in this train station and just noticed something. They had a huge screen, as they often do, not the ones that they use for departures and arrivals, but it just had the television news playing on it. It was always BBC 24 usually. And I remember looking at the feed. There was like a data feed at the bottom of the screen, and it had, amongst other things, the FTSE, the stock index, both in London and New York, and the highs and the lows, and then they had currencies, where the pound was relative to the euro and the dollar, etc. And I just remember thinking, why nobody's here in this space, this concourse is really interested in this. But why do they think we need to know about the stock market highs when very few people are directly invested, or currency balances, unless people are going on holiday, and even then they don't really care. I'm going to Spain anyway, I need some euro, blah, blah, blah. And you said it's to make us think that this stuff is important. And that really stuck with me. So I think that's one thing that the book does, is if people are not, I think you're right, it's not entry-level stuff, but I think for people who are already cognizant of what's going on around them, it really helps you to tune in. You do see things, other layers of, symbolism, archetypal dimensions, in use of music and images, and just all the stuff we're being bombarded with all the time.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. When you go through a modern city, or even on a train through a modern train station, through a city center, you're basically entering a machine to create categories of importance within your psyche, whether it be advertising, whether it be things like, how to use the traffic lights, how to cross the road, how to do everything. Is a protocol involved, and the protocol is that you, even if this thing has no impact on your life whatsoever, you have to know about it, and it has to be embedded into your consciousness at some level. And it was a great example you gave there about the Nasdaq and the FTSE, and the average person, unless you're involved in trading, has no desire to be involved in this. 99.9% of the people watching those broadcasts have nothing to do with it, but it's all the bells in the background in the old days to let you know who was in charge. Who was in charge in the old days? Well, the church would ring in the center of the village or the town. That's the boss. Now, you may not even go to church, you may not even be Christian, but you're made aware this is the big Mac Daddy in town. You have to hear this. And the same thing with the call to prayer in Islam. Well, here we go. It's the same thing. This is to tell you who's in charge. This is the money gods, the gods of money. They're putting their sigils and their sacred scriptures, or it's almost like the way that the FTSE and the number is very similar to the Bible and a reference. It's very similar to that, and it's all about training you from the time you're consciously aware that this stuff is part of your world, even though you don't have anything to do with it. It's to remind you who God is, and these are the gods of money who run the modern world, what we call globalization now.
Well, one thing I noticed, I don't know how long it's been there. My computer's currently running Windows 10, because when I had Windows 7, which was far superior, stroke less inferior, the hard drive on the computer failed. When I got a new one installed, the guys said, well, it comes, you've got Windows 10, that's it, unless you want to switch to a completely different OS. But anyway, I now notice that I have the stock market stuff. Not always, I've not tracked when this occurs. Bottom right, you'll see it, everyone looks down at their computer. Yep. If you're on a laptop or similar, you'll see, for example, it's telling me now that it's 7 degrees and cloudy here. And where that information is, I've now started to notice, probably been there for a while, as I said, stock market stuff, just showing what's up and down. And it's really, well, I can find this information readily if I want it. So why is it there? It's now on the computer screen. It's like, what next? So I'm going to have like something on the inside of my eyelids so I can know what the Nasdaq and the FTSE are doing while I sleep. It's absurd. And one thing
that's not,
go ahead.
And that's not even that's not even what the real stockbrokers consult. In the old days, they, I don't know how it is now, but they would have the Fortran system, which is very complex trading data. So they didn't even pay attention to that stuff. That was nothing. They were deep inside the hardcore stuff that, within the stocks, within the stock bed and the trading and so on. So it's just purely a flag they're waving. That's all it is.
Yeah, one thing I don't think I mentioned in my train station story, I said so many years ago, I'd have to go back and re-listen to our talk. And I'm mentioning it because it was just a piece of high strangeness that was in that station on that particular day when I just happened to be reading the Anvil of Psyche and noticed these stock market figures on the screen. On the concourse, it was actually Leeds Station. If you've ever been, it's just as
Yeah.
you go in the door, just one big, almost square seating area with
Box.
shops and screens and whatnot. As I walked through the station, I was only getting a short, like a local train. I'd come into city centre for some relatively short time and I was heading back. As I came out of the station, there was, get this, I'd like some guys watching this. I know there's some people in the tribe who don't understand symbolism and auguries and whatnot. There was a crab on the concourse on the floor, a crab, okay? You expect it to be in a rock pool by the seaside. It was on the floor, just kind of squirming around. And I thought, well, fuck me, what the hell? And I tried to figure out how it could have come to have been there. Probably some mundane explanation. So I left the station, and when I came back about an hour later, I didn't think anything of it. I'd forgotten all about the crab, more or less. The crab was still there, and no one near it, but one of its, a couple of its legs were crushed, and it was still alive. And it was actually quite distressing, you know? I remember looking at this living thing and I thought, what's going on here? It's like somebody just stamped on it out of sheer badness. But anyway, that came back to me when I was rereading the book and thinking about our interview, and it may have no relevance to anything, but one of those things, it's like seeing a light in the sky or somebody saying something weird to you, or a stranger, just something occurs that marks that day, and it's more than just what it seemed to be on the surface. That's how it felt. You know what they say about synchronicities? Jung would often say it's the importance that you assign to them.
Oh, that was very meaningful, and that was meant for you. I know that sounds almost like very woo and narcissistic, but no, these things are very interconnected. And when you go on these journeys where your consciousnness opens up to things, these bizarre events just happen. Now we know that somebody probably bought that crab from a fishmonger's and it fell out. Crabs do go out of the bag. It's happened to me. They can nip their way out of the bag, the plastic, especially the plastic ones. And the poor thing fell on the floor. It was probably accidentally crushed. Someone's walked on it, didn't see it maybe. But just think that crab was in an alien environment. I mean, that might as well have been a human on another dimension, on another planet. It would have not been suited to understand that. But at the same time, what in symbolism does crabs represent? The moving up from the subconscious realms into the conscious realms. And this is, very deep symbolism, the crab, the crustacean, the depths of the human psyche coming to the surface. And so that wasn't an accident. Things like that happen to me all the time. In fact, when you put meaning upon them, they continuously happen in all different ways. It's just in the most, it just shows that there's definitely a way to hack the reality of this not necessarily directly, but indirectly, symbolism and things like that. And when you go into a deep state of conscious awareness, these things will happen. So yeah, I would consider that. If that happened to me, I would consider that one of the most significant events in my life, because and also the stress part of it was probably the pain of waking up. The pain of coming to it's a very painful thing for people to realize that they live in a world that's basically a piece of pathological theater designed to make them behave and think in a certain way that's not not natural. They're just following orders.
Another thing that occurred to me at the time was, you'll have heard the phrase, you yourself, Thomas, and others watching this perhaps, about crabs in a bucket and how they behave. Now, this is crabs that have been fished for at seaside or wherever, and I've been fished for many years myself. One thing that you might try to do, especially if it's shellfish, is to keep them alive until they're going to be cooked. This all starting to sound a bit macabre, but that's just the way it is. But one thing, apparently, I've not observed this personally, but I'm told that If you put a bunch of crabs into a bucket, I don't know if they've got any sense of things potentially not going well in their future or anything like that. But if a bucket's not an easy thing to get out of, imagine a plastic or metal bucket, almost sheer sides. A crab trying to get out of that, apparently other crabs have been observed in the bucket to pull that crab back down. And there's an analogy here that I thought about in terms of so-called awakening, or people trying to make their own way in the environments, in the mass media matrix. Is that the idea there in the crabs in the bucket is, don't get ideas above your station. Where do you think you're going? You're down here with the rest of us. Don't you get any ideas about getting out of this? In fact, we need, these crabs who would escape, we need them all to stay here, because we're all kind of confirming that everything's actually okay with this. And we know what's going on. There isn't a problem, basically. If you see someone, it's like the Scientologists, isn't it? You see someone trying to get out, indicates that all may not be well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. I mean, symbolism is all over the book, The Anvil of the Psyche. It was a very big thing for me, and had been for about 10 years prior to that. And, I even describe how it was used to mesmerize people as well. Like, when, rather than you discovering these symbols for yourself, the long history of these priest classes, mesmerizing and well, I won't say bewitching, but fascinating other people. I give the example of the parade of idols through the Ishtar gates in ancient Babylon, where they seem to have learned in Babylon the art of psychic manipulation, through taking it to it almost like industrial level, where they knew the population could be controlled if they gave them a pseudo spiritual performance, i.e., a nighttime parade of idols through the Ishtar Gate, just to overwhelm them. And this was continued on later on through history, even in things like stained glass in the great cathedrals of Europe, and back in the Middle Ages and later, late Middle Ages, Europeans, peasants would take tremendous pilgrimages to see the famous cathedral wherever they lived, in France or England or whatever. And you imagine the world they lived in was basically pretty rustic, very rustic. Suddenly they enter into this darkened building like Notre Dame or Salisbury Cathedral, or, one of the great Catholic basilicas. And they look up at this, and in the darkness is this incredible stained glass window they've never seen anything like it in their lives. And to them, that would have been, it's very difficult for us to understand this today, because we get so much sensory overload. But to a peasant in the Middle Ages, that would have been like a combination of a spiritual, psychedelic experience that would have put them in psychic bondage of the church for all eternity. Well, for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and this being at a time, if we think about that Middle Ages, when virtually no one could read or write, that was like almost a form of magic in itself. If you could take a book, and speak back the contents of the book, that was some magical art. So the cathedrals were designed to overwhelm the senses, and I guess that's what we're looking at. No, I mean, you can take overwhelm the senses in a good way as well, like just being awestruck. I'm sure we've all had pleasure of maybe seeing a natural scene, or maybe a building or a piece of art or something, or a piece of music that we just felt washed away by, the awesomeness of it. Just aren't words for this. It doesn't happen very often. So it doesn't have to be a negative thing, but I think overwhelm the senses. If you were a medieval peasant going to visit one of these great cathedrals, you wouldn't have anything else in your consciousness when you were there. You'd be so awestruck by the thing. And the dark side of that is literally having no room for anything else. So you see that today, and this, I think, is where the Anvil of the Psyche was ahead of the curve, or very much crest of the wave in terms of a media environment that we were already in, but what has happened between the release of the book and now, in terms of like ubiquitousness and just the absolute not inability, but the Herculean efforts that people have to go to if they want to escape that immersion. I spoke a little bit about this actually at my presentation at Mysterious Earth, I was talking about sound environment, how that's changed over time. I think you can apply that to all the audio visual spectra in terms, well, from entertainment through to like what they call now infotainment, through to the news cycle. And so, yeah, really, it's if you were to revise Anvil the Psyche for today, I suggest you certainly wouldn't need to rewrite it, but it would probably just be like it's all that on steroids, isn't it? Really?
Yeah. And something remarkable has happened since the book came out and how this stuff is now done to the public. The spectacular no longer exists because everyone's jaded by the spectacular. I remember, like you were talking about being wowed. The first time that happened to me was when I went to visit Times Square in New York at night, and I'd never seen, lighting like that anywhere in my life. Like this, the gigantic billboards moving and just the sheer dazzling brightness of it. And it was a very pleasant experience, I have to say. It wasn't negative because I was enjoying what I was seeing. But people, that doesn't work anymore. But now they've reversed it. They've inverted it now. And now it's kind of a minimalist, almost like a Bauhaus version of my. Oh, speaking of Bauhaus, the cover of the book, The Anvil of the Psyche, is inspired by a song on Peter Murphy's first solo album after he left Bauhaus called Socrates. The album is called If the World Should Fail to Fall Apart, and the song is called Socrates and the Python. And that's what the image I painted for the cover is the goblet that Socrates took to commit suicide by drinking hemlock, and Pythagoras is the python wrapped around it. Sorry, I just digressed there for a second, but there's a story behind the cover. But yeah, there's a minimalism now. Okay, so let's talk about the last 4 years, the Rona thing. Did they lock down the world in a state of terror by spectaculars? Not at all. Quite the opposite. A line of trucks, military trucks, parked on a darkened street in Milan, with nothing happening, was enough to terrorize the population. The sheer minimal impact of that image. The trucks did nothing. Nobody came in and out of them. They went nowhere. There was no sirens flashing. The trucks were merely parked on a street in a very artistic way. They become the whole thing of critical theory as it's made its way into kind of new nonlinear warfare has sort of the arts movement has now blended with the and I spoke about a little bit about this in Anvil of the Psyche, I think. The modern art scene has blended in with propaganda to produce things like this. I remember seeing an exhibition here years ago, and I was just walking into a room, and there was a video in the darkness of someone looking at you like this. And the impact of that was shocking because why is he looking at me? What is this all about? It's just you in the darkness. And they've been using this stuff now very effectively to control the public. And it's all come out of this kind of like non-linear warfare type critical theory. Uh, People talk about things like the Turner Prize in art, the modern art Turner Prize in the UK, and how stupid it is every year and how ridiculous it gets. But you ever notice that a few years later, what that is about becomes culture? I remember one, and it was around 2012, that there was one exhibit that didn't win the Turner Prize, but it was one of the finalists, and it was to show the emotional intensity. It was a very good piece actually, to show the emotional intensity of everyday objects in terms of what they can say. And one of the things the guy demonstrated was two light switches. A modern light switch, it looks benign, right? It looks benign. But a 1930s light switch, the kind of like circular Bakelite thing with the switch in the middle that goes up and down, that has an element of sinisterness to it. And you can't explain why, but it does because it shows maybe poverty, war. We associate that as the light switches they might have had in the death camps in Nazi Germany and so on, or horror films. And they've learned about this and they've been used, and that that exhibit that was for the Turner then became the Chinese person on a fuzzy video falling over in the street, or the line of trucks in Milan. And it was enough. They didn't need anything else. They didn't have to give any professionals on screen saying, this is what it's happening. Here's the data. Here's the numbers. That was irrelevant. Enough. All they needed was that line of trucks. So there's a sophistication that has creeped in since the Anvil of the Psyche that has definitely taken its influence from modern art, in particular the kind of stuff that ends up with Turner Prizes. I remember the Turner Prize a few years ago, a guy wearing a dress who makes ceramics of children being abused won the Turner Prize, and he was a grown guy, and he shows up collecting his prize dressed in a little girl's frock. And here we are today, with the stuff going on around the whole trans thing and everything. So this is why I personally always pay a careful attention to things like the Turner Prize, because it's almost like they're giving us the trailer of what's coming down the line in society.
Yeah, and there was always a thing that, as you say, oh well, this is like a sick joke. This will never fly, and then at some point, suddenly you find it integrated, seamlessly into the culture. And it seems to be like that across the board, not just in the arts, but in wider culture and just in society and all the systems it depends on it. There's insulting people's intelligence and just debasing, sort of cultural mores and standards. And it's just basically to insult your intelligence. How much more ugliness can you possibly put up with? How much more can you be lied to absolutely blatantly, knowingly on both sides and still just say, okay, yeah, that's the way that it is? And I think that all of this kind of coming to a bit of a crescendo during the C19 period, and that's one thing I did reflect back on when rereading The Anvil, the Psyche, was like, well, here we saw, this is like the playbook that was put into action, as I said earlier, on steroids throughout that time. Everything, absolutely everything. You talked about that line of trucks in Milan. That's you say doing nothing. Wasn't there a ship moored in somewhere in Ireland? Maybe it was in Dublin.
Yeah, yeah. A naval ship right behind a military hospital that was set up in the docklands in Dublin. For what reason? The same reason the trucks were in Milan. It was just a piece of performance art. The pop culture thing is basically, people think pop culture is just pop culture for the sake of it. It just comes across. Now, you being a music journalist and a former musician yourself knows that couldn't be further from the truth. But it's very difficult to explain to the average person that you can draw a direct line between the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Blur, Oasis, vaxxed, unvaxxed, because it creates these dualities of the winning, who's the better one, who's the winning team, and I got to be on the side of the winning team. Who wins this battle? And it even goes one further. Not only did you get vaxxed, unvaxxed, but you got like I've heard people in my town say, "Oh well, I got the Moderna or I got the Pfizer. It's much better than your AstraZeneca." That's Beatles, Stones, Blur, Oasis, AstraZeneca, Pfizer. They have been conditioned to believe that they're getting with the winning, and even in soccer, Manchester United, Liverpool, they've been these are all ways that the public have been trained to pick a side, but never ever step off the chessboard. This is the whole thing. Once you're on the chess, they want you on that chessboard, black square, white square, it doesn't matter. Play the game. The whole thing is that while you're saying, this band is better than that band, this actor is better than that actor, blah 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 blah, you are still on the chessboard. It's brilliant when you think about it. When you actually think about it, it's brilliant. It's a way of keeping you in the game without you actually thinking, hold on a second. It's like that old film, War Games. It was with, I think, Matthew Broderick when he was a kid was in it. A very good kids movie, actually. One of the better kids movies from the 80s. And they teach the game noughts and crosses to the computer, which is also what the Americans call tic-tac-toe. And the computer goes, this is a very interesting game. The only way to win is not to play. That's very profound for a kid's movie. But yeah, that's the whole thing. They got to keep you on the chessboard.
Yeah, it's like, do you want ketchup or do you want mustard on your shit sandwich? Like, which is it going to be? It's funny you mentioned war games because that's exactly what I was thinking. And then you just brought it up like within a few seconds. So you read my mind on that one. Yeah, the only way to win is not to play. And that's such a counterintuitive idea for people, because this is like an either or, as you said, dualistic culture increasingly. So the war of all against all, as Steiner spoke about. And speaking of matters mystical and esoteric, if we delve into the occult philosophy, one of the things that you learn is that these are not that, light is not the opposite of darkness. It's a question of like how much light there is and how dark it is. If you watch out, the window of your house during the day, it's not that suddenly there is light and then there is darkness. Suddenly there's less light, if you see what I mean, for a while. So things that tend to be on a spectrum, good and evil are not opposites. They're on the same thing. It's just a question of where it falls in all of that. So, but that is very, again, counterintuitive to the way we're taught to think about the world and just reality in general. But once you start to integrate some of that, and again, this is probably for more advanced students of all this, you then begin to appreciate how important the non-material and the esoteric dimensions are to the topics that we're talking about, the world as presented to us, and how much those are understood and manipulated by those who would tell us that it's all nonsense and there is no such thing, as it were.
Yeah, and then they wonder why they have an emotional debate with somebody regarding the war between Russia and Ukraine. Again, two sides. That means nothing to them in their life. It's nothing to do with them at all. But yet they have this deep emotional investment in it. Why? Because of that magic box in the corner of the room, the internet or the TV screen. It has created the fault. That is the chessboard. It's created this false reality. They have an emotional investment in something that in no way affects their lives in any way, will never affect their lives in any way. And it's deeply meaningful for them, to the point where I was having a discussion with a book dealer I know here. And he's a nice guy, but what do you call him, normie? He's very much tied up with the normal things. And we were talking about the situation in the Ukraine, and I said, I don't care. I mean, I said, I care that like innocent people are dying and young people are dying, but I don't care in that effect that I'm not going to get worried about it one way or the other. And he goes, why not? And I go, because I don't live there. I'm not Ukrainian. I'm not Russian. It's not, it's not irrelevant. And he goes, is that how you feel about starving people in Africa? And I took a breath for this one and I went, yeah. And he literally went green. And I said, he says, you didn't care like when I know, says, no, I don't care. He said, no, I can't do anything. And I know things like watching Live Aid and Bob Geldof saying, give me your fucking money. It's not going to feed Africa or solve Africa's problems. I have no connection to it. And he says, so what did you feel about Live Aid? I said, it was just great music. That's all I cared about. I didn't care about anything else. And he goes, Jesus, Thomas, that's very cold. And I said, it's not cold. It's the truth. You just don't. I'm not going to give myself to something I can't change. And he goes, gosh, you're some man. And when we finished the conversation, he says to me, I hope we're still friends. Like, he couldn't even have the conversation outside the parameters set by the protocols of the conventions given to him by mass media and society.
Yeah, well, even larger than that, I think, than the Russia-Ukraine issue, which is relatively recent. You notice how the pandemic thing, that was switched. It was like they were two sides of the same coin, that literally you went to bed one night, if you were paying attention, which hopefully you weren't, to the mainstream media, it was pandemic all the way. And then at some point it was like, and it was Ukraine.
Oh, on the Monday evening, the Irish media was filled with ministers considering mandatory vaccinations. That was the Monday evening. And I said to myself, they're going to stop it any second now. This is the last rush. And I couldn't believe it. I get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and it said all restrictions have been lifted. And what was all across the news? Russia has just invaded Ukraine.
Yeah, of course. Never mind. Without getting into a discussion of that, because that then puts us in the same camp more or less. But of course, it was that's a proxy war really by Russia's enemies, and Ukraine, on behalf of others, had been poking that wasp's nest in Russia for so long that Putin eventually, a man of like seemingly infinite patience, and just said, all right, I'm not having this. I'm not having you shelling ethnic Russians who just happen to live in Ukraine. But that's for another day. But when it comes to the whole Israel-Palestine thing, you see the same thing there. I've certainly had conversations, well, I wouldn't even call them conversations, exchanges where it's come up, as it often does, especially not that long ago when there was, there was a big flare up in violence, wasn't there? I can't even remember the details. And people, at work or, socially, whatever, they're talking about this again, like they're really invested in it. They should be. And they don't understand if someone like me says, this is none of my business. It's
Yeah,
none of
I
my
mean,
business.
it's not that we don't have compassion. We do have compassion. And I am aware of the dynamics that led to what happened in the Ukraine-Russia thing. And I do have, like, I was shocked by what happened in October 7th in Israel and all that stuff. But at the same time, too, there might be a fleeting, like, Jesus Christ, emotional reaction. But after a few hours, I'm completely back to normal. It's not the same thing with something like Live Aid. It's not that I don't have compassion for those people that were starving in Ethiopia at that time. It's just that I'm not going to invest my life into trying to change it when I know I can't. I mean, this is what I don't understand. I think it drives people away from their potential, to be honest with you. Unless they're directly on the ground feeding people or stopping bullets from flying. This telescopic philanthropy and this emotional telescopic philanthropy leads people ultimately away from the empowerment of the self. If you're sitting there, you're really hardcore picking sides, the Israel Palestine or the Ukraine Russian thing or vaxxed unvaxxed thing, and you're really picking sides that you've got. This is my team has to win this. Or that for the team, I'm not talking about for yourself. The individual is different. That was cared about during the Rona years. It's just I wanted my safety. I didn't care what anyone else wanted to do with their lives, and hopefully help other people see through that. But this concept of you have all these issues in your life you need to take care of, and they have got you worried about parts of the world you don't worry about. I actually believe that this philanthropy has destroyed the band U2. U2 has been destroyed by philanthropy, by Bono's need to play God. Okay, I'll say that right here. I don't mean he's a bad guy. He meant it in a bad way, but it has destroyed that band completely. When I think of the first four albums and I look at what they've become now, and I said, where did that an incredible spiritual spark of music end up with him with George Bush Jr. trying to save Africans? One of the biggest mass murderers in history as his new best friend. I mean, things like that. I thought because you're constantly pushing away from yourself, this sort of like missionary psychosis develops in people. And eventually, you can have a situation, I'm sure it happens all the time, where someone's more worried about someone in another country where their own kids don't have their own kids in their own home don't have food on the table. And this is always, always, always to distract from your dharma, your purpose, your hero's journey, and so on. And that's what I think was one of the biggest messages I put across in the Anvil, the Psyche, is be aware, pay attention, but don't let it take you away from your path to your own enlightenment. And because that's what the entire mechanism is designed to do.
Well, what I've said a couple of times to people who are like, albeit a bit passively aggressively, they're people who I know and they want to continue to have some want or need to some kind of, friendly relationship regarding Israel Palestine. I said, listen, I know personally what it was like to grow up in a war zone between two seemingly intractable sides with a load of well-meaning do-gooders getting involved from 2,000 miles away, thinking that they had the answer. And I'm talking about the troubles in Ulster, and I'm talking about Americans raising money. I'm talking about Dave Mustaine from Megadeth in 1988 blathering about the cause from a stage, and he knew fuck all about it. And we're all just stood there, Protestants and Catholics in the audience, not knowing which was which, just going, is this guy really doing this? Like, give the guy a bigger shovel just so he can get to the bottom of this pit quicker, So I understand how that works, and what happens in the end up, if you could call that situation resolved now, what resolved it? It resolved the parties directly involved talking to each other.
Yeah, exactly. Without the middleman, the media. The media is the monster. That's what the media was, the original priesthood between the people and the gods. And when the people didn't talk amongst each other, the media could control the mediums, the center ground could control it. This is the whole thing. The media can either help or it can hinder, but most times it hinders. And like you said, the best thing to do is for the direct involved parties to discuss their things and take them out. Yeah, I remember that Megadeth event too as well. I mean, I shouldn't laugh, but I did. I did when I heard what he said on the stage, and it was like, "Oh boy, you really don't know what you really don't know Ireland, do you?" But I'm sure it's things like that. I mean, I remember when I first went to America. Uh, I didn't grow up in the same situation. You grew up in the south of Ireland, but there was still a great shame. It's like the IRA were terrible, like they were bombing British cities and stuff. You didn't associate with them, that kind of thing. That was my attitude to it. I didn't want to be involved in anything that was bombing people or hurting them. And I remember getting to America, meeting Irish Americans who'd be openly saying things like, "I fucking love the IRA" and all this stuff. I'd never heard anything like that in Ireland, except from and even the ones who would have been like what we call Chuckies and like Chucky LR types, even the full-on shinners, wouldn't usually talk in that way about it. The kind of a thing. They'd be like the bearded Jerry Adams types who kind of like to be like intellectually trying to justify it. But I'd never heard it spoken like that. And I can honestly, God, it shocked me. It shocked me, the disconnect. But it made me kind of realize too that I probably felt the same way too about things in other countries. Because I can remember before then, when I was a young kid, the war between Iraq and Iran. And I remember like watching the news between the Shiites and the Sunnis and all this stuff, and thinking how like they were all nuts and stuff like that. But the complexities are lost in that translation that the media give us.
But do you remember that? It's funny you bring that war up because people talk about sort of, what's happening in Ukraine, for example, or in the Middle East. Like at any given point, there's one or two wars going on, or what they would even refer to as a war, but a conflict, whatever the difference is. But at any given time, there's probably about 100+ wars happening all around the planet. But my memory of the news coverage of Iran, Iraq, was that Iraq was the ones we were supposed to root for. Uh, Rangers and Celtic or whatever, it was like Saddam Hussein was the guy, and it was the mad mullahs in Iran, because, of course, relatively speaking, Iraq was not secular, but it wasn't like a theocracy type thing. And this is one of the things that a lot of the Western media very quickly had to bury when, in 1990, when the Iraq thing kicked off, was that under Saddam Hussein, more people than ever had, electricity and clean water and proper sanitation in their homes. There were more women in professions like, law and medicine under Saddam Hussein. There were more women at universities in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. I'm not saying he's a good guy. I'm just saying that, it ain't dualistic, is it? It's not black and white. None of this stuff is.
No. And it's funny how the two most functional Arab nations in the Middle East, North Africa, Libya, and Iraq, which did provide protection for Christians and other minorities, and they had very strict prohibitions on anyone who dare attack someone who was Christian. They were both attacked by the US and destroyed.
In
what?
Saddam Hussein's regime, people probably forget about this character called Tariq Aziz. I think he was either executed or killed during the war. He's Saddam Hussein's number two. He's a Christian.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And it's like they want to deliberately generate. I mean, I know we're going off topic, but it's kind of not off topic because they have you rooting for teams that they can actually change at any moment. It's like the Who, speaking of the Who, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. They constantly do get fooled again, and they always will, until you realize that you cannot, that system is not there for you, it's for them, and you should only observe it and not be in the game.
One thing that springs from all that then is thinking about in the intervening years from when the Anvil Psyche was published to now. I think that without a doubt, as I say, the pandemic period was sort of for anybody who was still questioning, excuse me, who might have read the book and questioned sort of, well, we see some evidence of this, but they won't be able to do this, they won't be able to do that. Doing X, Y, and Z would be, a bridge too far. I remember saying after 9/11, which we've spoken about before, is a very pivotal event for all sorts of reasons. Yes, materially, but also I think in terms of our, the collective human psyche, without a doubt. That's maybe where, like an iceberg, most of that, and same with the pandemic, I would say most of that is beneath the surface, or exists beneath the surface. I would have said, well, you're telling me, this is pre 9/11, that at some point we're going to be going to airports, we're going to be taking our belts off, our boots off, we're not going to be allowed to take bottles of water through security, and blah, blah, blah. And we're going to have to be at the airport, even if it's a half-an-hour flight, we're going to have to be there 3 hours before. And we're going to go to New York and we're going to have our irises scanned to get into the country. Pardon the pun, but that won't fly. I honestly would have said, no, that's ridiculous. People won't put up with that. Okay. So then we found ourselves in that very situation, and people just put up with that. And there were things as the pandemic period began to unfurl, like from March 2020, basically, there were certain thresholds that we reached. I thought we wouldn't reach. I thought, well, that's going to be too much for people. Now, we never had mandatory jabs, but there was a lot of talk about it. You see what I mean? So, and I tried to envision what that would be like. I said, yeah, people will not accept that. They cannot drag people from their homes and stick a needle in them. And having lived through all that period without that actually happening, I wouldn't really rule anything off the table, however unlikely or unworkable it might seem, in the wake of some future quote unquote, catastrophic events. I wouldn't rule anything out at all, including people being dragged to camps. Let's face it, it's happened in the past. So through the lens of like the Anvil, the Psyche, I think that just shows us like how far we've come. And we've spoken about restrictions being relaxed in the pandemic period and all that, and where we find ourselves, what's happened since that all kind of died down to where we are now. But I don't think we're not out the other side of anything at all. I think it's just constantly being reframed and reiterated and presented in different ways, if you see what I mean. So I think more the pandemic period is more like a kind of a test, like a weather balloon or something. Let's try this and see what happens. Let's just poke the wasp nest and see what sort of reaction we get. And they learn something from that. The same way you do in battle, don't you? You say, okay, well, we're going to try a little incursion into this territory, see how the enemy reacts, and see what we can learn from that.
Yeah, there is no ultimate great victory. There is no revelation. There's no utopia at the end of any path. There's only the tools that we can gather up along the way to survive and prosper and to avoid it. I mean, that's the only thing that drives me in my work. From day one, I've never believed that the day was going to come and we were going to arrest all. I mean, I've said someone the other day by saying they're never going to arrest Fauci. That's never going to happen. And they so wanted that, But I said, no, you didn't get the mandatory jabs. You're safe. You're in the clear. Get on, enjoy your life. That's take the victory on a personal level, and that's what I've always tried to maintain in all my work. Is like, I've often, there's people in the alternative scene who are trying to make out that one day will come along and arrest all the criminals, and this human race will suddenly like one day wake up. And no, that's all rooted in that sort of Christian evangelism thing. It's not true. The only thing that's true is that you can get through this with the toolkits and the Anvil, the Psyche. And in fact, a lot of my books are toolkits for surviving this stuff and getting through, and not my videos as well, to get through this stuff. And we are going through a monumental state of flux right now. I didn't even envision this. I mean, things are happening very, very rapidly at incredible speed. I also believe there's tremendous cosmic events coming on. And even you asking me to do this show again, I mean, there's an element of time is moving backwards for those of us who want to go backwards. And I don't mean that literally chronologically. I mean, in terms of sort of like a psychic cultural element. And it's definitely true. It's happening to me all the time now. And I think there's definitely some cosmic event happening. I don't know what it is. I haven't got a clue. But I know it's unfurling right now. And it's happening at breakneck speed. And it isn't salvation that's there for those of us who want it. There's an easier way to navigate the future for those of us who want it. Absolutely, truly believe that with all my heart and soul. That if you've got the tools and the knowledge and the ability to see what's going on, you will write this thing out with a hell of a lot of uh, more ease than the average person. I mean, when I saw that, I can always remember at the height of the Rona going into town to mail a package. And I was like, I was angry about the lockdown, but otherwise, that was it. And to see the absolute terror in people's faces at the post office and the shops, and thinking to myself, well, thank God I'll never be like that. You know, I'll never be made that way. And what I hope I hope not made that way. And that's worth the admission price alone. You know, the admission price alone is worth having. Is worth being able to not be immune to it, but to recognize it when it's going on, and have enough cynicism to avoid its most pathological machinations.
Yeah, well, I'm paraphrasing now, but maybe it might even be the first page of the book, or it might be the description on the reverse, just talking about people with ideas and opinions and tastes, predilections, desires, dreams, all of this stuff that are not their own. Where do they come from? And that fear that you saw on the people's faces in the post office was not coming from like within them in the truest sense. This is why you weren't feeling fearful. It's entirely like pardon the pun, injected into them, from outside. It's
Yeah,
like, this is what to be afraid of today. This is
yeah,
what to like today. This is what to hate today. The dualistic black and white thing all over again. And it's this inability to, and it's inculcated, it absolutely is, very, very deliberately, I think, this, inability not just to think for yourself, but to judge situations. I think that you can see that in its crudest sense, this is why people fucking fall off cliff faces trying to take selfies or whatever. It's just this childlike inability to navigate the world, the physical world and the non-physical world, in any sort of state of independence, as it were. This childlike idiocy is inculcated in people, reinforced through politics and the media and culture as well, in particular. And it's absolute learned helplessness. And I think what we saw in the pandemic period very much was that with this ramping up of this dependence, not just for information, but like literally, which is one thing that has continued in the wake of it, increasing physical dependence. By that, I mean sort of you can't, trying to make a living for yourself, trying to be self-supporting and independent in that sense, to provide for yourself. It's getting more and more difficult, again, depending on how you come at these matters. And that's certainly part of the technocratic agenda going forward, isn't it? It's that level of control, because if we can be dragged back down the kind of the pyramid, as it were, in terms of, say, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if we literally have to, this is natural, if we have to focus more on providing food and shelter, we've got less time for self-development. There's, a critical way of looking at what's happening around us.
yeah. The way I see it is start looking for opportunity growth. I mean, the recent elections in the, I that's, but I know it's presented opportunities for me to escape that were coming down the line. But at least it's buying time. There are certain agendas that were going to be rolled out, by the globalists, and they probably will still come up. They'll be watching the game that way. That's how, if there is a game, that's how I would play it. Look, you hear a lot within the truth world, the alternative world, wherever you want to call the scene we're in. Maybe not so much from our end of it, but in general about Satanism, and they're all the elites are all satanic, and there's a lot of truth to that. But the problem is that people don't actually know what Satanism is. They don't know they think that Satanism is worshiping the devil, and they think that Satanism is, you know, dressing up and worshiping, having rituals and sacrificing virgins. There's nothing like that at all. It's the true meaning of Satanism in this ritual sense is the concept of application of natural law. And this seems, whatever, if there is a religion or a philosophical or spiritual concept behind the secret unknowns, as Andy Garcia called them in Godfather 3, It is it's a true satanic one, but not in a religious sense. It's the concept of they make you're given a choice, and whether you make that choice one way or another, you've done that. You've made that choice. It's like when Jonathan Harker is asked to step over the threshold into Dracula's castle in Transylvania. He in the book he feels a sense of maybe I shouldn't do this, but he still does it. And that's what they do. That's how they think. So they can never say, you know, like it's like the vaccine, right? They can never turn around and say we were forced vaccinated. No, the choice was given. And then they say, yeah, but they coerced me my job. Fair enough, but the choice was still given, you know. So if it ever came to a court of law, it's not like, you know, people keep saying, you know, we should take it to Nuremberg too. But Nuremberg too, the first the first process that's going to be laid out was who was mandatorily vaxxed. Answer: no one, no one, right? So that's Satanism, right? So therefore, they're completely in the clear. You were given a choice. No one was held down, and the needle stuck in their arm. Coercion is not the same thing as being assaulted. You were not assaulted. You assaulted yourself, if anything. Now, this is a very painful thing for a lot of people to want to listen to because it absolves them of their own, satanic mindset that they got to look after number one because the ones in charge are not looking after them. And so it's pure Satanism in that leve Satanist natural law. I mean, that's why I'm so glad I read a Satanic Bible when I was 14 because it really set me up for the rest of my life of how these people actually function. You know, because that was if you want the book of how they think, that's it. They give you the choice. If you make it, you say yes or you say no. And if you say yes, I mean, I always remember seeing footage of World War I, and it's actually it's that Peter Jackson film. They shall not grow old, whatever. And they're interviewing people, and literally fellas were saying, "I joined up because a band was playing, a marching band was playing, and we followed the marching band into the recruiting center." And then this. I remember that one scene changed my whole image of World War I, the concept of the poppy and everything. And it's like, unless they were drafted, and many of them weren't, most of them weren't, that was their own free will. That was the application of natural law, and they abided, they went against it. They threw themselves into, I always remember here in Ireland that the whole thing was like the Irish down south, the Irish Catholics down south, what, like 90,000 of them or something, or I think it was like 90,000 Irishmen were killed in World War I fighting, and it was all about in the south of Ireland. It was all about, well, you got to do it for little Catholic Belgium. But little Catholic Belgium was a murderous royal empire during World War I, undertaking horrific wars against Africans in the Congo and places like that. And yet, so these same fellas would, if you were saying, well, I'm fighting for Ireland against the British Empire, and here they were dying in the Somme. I mean, on the Irish Volunteers. The Irish Volunteers died in the Somme for the British and Belgian royal families, thinking it was going to free Ireland from the British royal family. If that's not astounding in terms of how you can gaslight people and you can make people, and it was all voluntary. The Irish Volunteers. It wasn't the Irish, draft. It was the Irish Volunteers. They volunteered to be machine gunned and run over by German tanks and die on barbed wire in the Somme. And then we're supposed to say, oh, the poor guys, they didn't really have a choice. They had a choice, you know. So it's still sad. It's still terrible. And I feel the same way with the people who are getting sick from the vax. It's sad. It's terrible. But unless they were children or old people in a home, they had a choice, folks. And this is part of, like, if the Anvil of the Psyche has to have a meaning in the post-Rona period, it's like you have no more excuses anymore. You have no, unless they're holding you down, you've no more excuses. You have to, if you make choices and they don't work out, you have to accept it. And this is when I hear these people go Nuremberg 2 for the COVID criminals and all this stuff. Why? What did they do? They didn't do anything criminal. You volunteered. You were the volunteer. And this is the whole thing. Be very careful what you're volunteering for, because when it all goes wrong, you'll have no one to blame but yourself. And that's a cold, harsh truth that people need to like really start getting wise to. And if there's anything ever going to save us as a species from transhumanism, it's learning the ability to say no.
Absolutely. And this is a kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it? Not for us, or maybe a lot of people watching here, but in terms of personal responsibility, like excuse me, we're discouraged from taking it. In fact, those of us trying to do it, trying to, walk our own path, we're having obstacles put in our way. So people are encouraged not to do it. They're given these, support systems, dependent systems, like getting someone addicted to heroin or whatever. You have to keep going back to your dealer, and you're told that it's like making your own way or making your own decisions is dangerous. And so but very much that is, where the answer lies. But we got to a point now in terms of generations. I certainly see, and when I broach this general subject, I'm aware of sounding like, grumpy old man, which couldn't be further from the truth. But, people who are young enough to be my kids, but they're still adults, you know what I mean, not very much well into their 20s. And I encounter a lot of these people in day-to-day activities. It's just not even the sort of lack of a desire to, have some kind of independence or autonomy or think and act for themselves, but it's just the idea of the very possibility. I could go back to, and this, my God, this was in the wake of 9/11, when there were a lot of concerns about what would happen, in the future direction of society in terms of security, in terms of anti-terrorist measures, etc. A lot of us observers were thinking, a bit uncomfortable. There's some bad stuff could come from this, not just airport security. And I remember having an online conversation with this guy, young, so I would have been early 30s at the time, and he probably was like late teens or maybe 20 or something. Not somebody I personally knew, but I was trying to, we had a conversation about what was happening with 9/11, and he was very much on board with what we need to do to combat the terrorists. So very much the literal, everything is exactly how it appears to be and how it's set out, and we need to do whatever's necessary. You saw again this with the pandemic, and the conversation kind of ended up, and I just kind of let him go. And the last thing he said to me was, and I was trying to articulate ideas of personal freedom that weren't all framed by, being on that chessboard. There's this massive world outside the chessboard. It's just a tiny little area, and to be in, both spiritually, emotionally, not just physically, ideologically, everything that makes up the human being. That's so narrow and confined and controlled. And his basically last response was, I don't understand the sort of freedom you're talking about. He couldn't conceptualize the sort of freedom I was, he just couldn't grasp it at all. I kind of felt sorry for him. I said, okay, that's fine, enjoy the rest of your evening. I've said, I think we're at.
I've had those experiences around things like climate change. You don't care about the environment. Of course I do. But, it's the same thing. They can't conceptualize anything that you're a climate denier or you're fully on board with the Greta Thunberg thing. One that happened as well, me, was the Black Lives Matter thing. Someone had mentioned that Black Lives Matter march that was going on in Dublin with the height of all that nonsense was happening. And I actually said, I don't care about Black Lives Matter. And they were like, Thomas, I've never heard you say a racist thing in your life. And I said, it's not racist. I don't care about Black Lives Matter. And I said, look, when they say Black Lives Matter, what they're really telling you to say is that your life doesn't matter. Your life doesn't matter. So your life as an individual, as a sovereign being, on your hero's journey, it doesn't matter. Black Lives Matter. It's a way of, again, it's almost like a way of removing yourself. It's almost like a dissociation of the self. You don't matter. Black Lives Matter. I mean, this is wicked stuff when you start really thinking about the implications of it. And it happens right during the Rona and all the lockdown and everything. Black Lives Matter. You don't matter. You don't matter. you know, and it's nothing to do with black and white or black people or whatever. It's a do purely with constantly pushing the boundaries. They do it all the time. You know, it's like like there was a psychopath who's going to work on an individual or a person will constantly test their boundaries. This, you know, they'll do things like they'll turn them against their friends slowly, you know, or they'll turn them against the relationship that they're in. They'll drop little things, and and the more they do it, eventually they will completely rebuild this person, right? We're being rebuilt all the time. You remember the water book or the ice bucket challenge? The ice bucket challenge. I'll never forget that as long as I live. I mean, that's a classic example. You have to pour a bucket of ice water over your head, and this kind of nonsense. And that was the vaccine before the vaccine. To see total training. Remember the Tide Pod challenge? These things don't come out of nowhere. These things are actively encouraged. And I would have went back before that to even things before the 70s, like pet rocks. Remember that in America they had a thing like a pet rock, just to see if they could get away with, just to see what a pet rock or Cabbage Patch children or fidget spinners. I find them very interesting that they appeared not long before the whole Rona and lockdown stuff. I find that, where did that all come from? What does that all mean? And they say, oh, it's to help autistic people. Yeah, fair enough, but like, why does every single shop in the world have them beside the sweet counter? You know? And so they're constantly testing people. And whenever, you know, I'll never forget the ice bucket challenge thing as long as I live. That was because it was like, oh well, it's to help people, it's charity. You know, so much wickedness is done in the name of charity, constantly.
Mm.
You know, and that's what I was saying. When you externalize yourself to something, you're robbing yourself of your own destiny. And it's endless. That's just one more example of it. Oh, I had to pour a bucket of water over my head, a video, and put it on the internet. Why? Well, everyone else was doing it.
Yeah, exactly. I feel similarly about the Movember thing, simply because it's something that I've seen people that I work with participate in it. In case people don't know, don't ask me to sum up in a sentence, but I think what's the charitable aim behind this? Growing a moustache? I can't even fucking remember what it's for. But
you fight breast cancer, I think.
oh no, that whole I see it now. I didn't get it until you just said it now, Thomas. I didn't understand at all the connection between moustaches and breast cancer, but now I get it. Thank you for that. I was wondering, so.
Oh, it's incredible,
It's ridiculous. I mean, it trivializes these issues. When people sort of try and panhandle me on the street, these young kids, God knows it must be difficult for them. They're out trying to recruit you to donate to their charity, and it'll be some global charity usually, where they're there probably on commission. I think the types I'm talking about. Sometimes they got a little bucket, sometimes, and it's always a young guy or young girl, usually quite good looking, and they smile, "Hello, sir, have you got time to talk to me? It's about this, blah blah blah." And I say I don't give to, as a rule, I don't give to major institutional charities. Oh, why not? I said I just like, if I'm going to do anything like that, I'll do it locally. So I'd rather buy a blanket, physically buy a blanket and take it down to the donkey sanctuary and say, there you go, guys, another blanket, because it's just so immediate. The connection is just right there. Or I see some guys in the city here who volunteer, and they have soup and sandwiches, and on a Friday evening they stand in one of the squares, and anybody who's homeless or in need of a meal can go there for a bit of warm up and get something decent to eat, blah blah blah. And the guys who are there who volunteer, some of them I think put in their own money to buy the food. So direct and so meaningful, and so and tailor it to whatever you want to do. If you're particularly motivated about animal cruelty, well, maybe you can do something directly to help that. But as you say, that what you referred to earlier as telescopic philanthropy, the sort of thing that Bono champions. I mean, how many times do we have to hear, another, horror story around one of those things before we begin to question about whether this is actually the appropriate way to go about it? And then you look at, I was reminded of cases like Epstein. I don't think Jeffrey Epstein was necessarily involved in any charities. I expect he would be some kind of mega rich person that he was. And you look at Prince Andrew, and his charitable works. You look at Jimmy Savile. Was there ever like a paragon of the charitable media personality than him? And so, yeah, I mean, all of these things are just, yeah, but I mean, well, Savile was just a bit of a freak, a bit of a one-off sort of thing. Well, yeah, I think he did enough damage for generations of people. And again, this is a kind of when that kind of mainstream um, consciousness, that channeling of all our own, abilities and will into some kind of collective thing, we're being siphoned off of our energy, being harvested. When that stuff goes wrong, boy, does it go wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and it's so pervasive, the energy harvesting elements of it. And I mean, if you want to talk about a business that's a psychopathic business, it's a big charity. I mean, literally nothing goes to the so-called people who are affected, but yet the CEOs are paid salaries that you get in like major Fortune 500 corporate companies. They get company cars and plush offices downtown, and they go off on fact-finding trips to Bali or somewhere like that, where or anywhere there's a championship golf course, and it I would, I give money directly to homeless people on the street, and like if I won the lotto, I wouldn't be giving tons of money to any corporate charity. And I know there are, and I've heard stories of famous people, actors, rock stars, pop stars, who do things like this. Like if they hear someone in the neighborhood is disabled, they'll pay to build a concrete ramp up to their front door so they can get in easier. That's charity. Giving money to friends of the earth, or like I remember reading a thing once that like Americans are the most charitable people in the world. This is back in the 80s. And I was saying, yeah, that makes sense. And then you looked into it, and they give more money to charity than anyone else. And then I looked into what the charities were. And they were like American Jews giving money to Israel, wealthy African Americans giving money to the United Negro College Fund. It wasn't charity. It wasn't really charity. It was basically the beginning of the NGO system where it was self-financing. Irish Americans giving money to the IRA, that kind of thing, or the Ireland Fund, this kind of thing. Not necessarily the IRA, but they like to say the American Ireland Fund. And that to me wasn't charity. That was to me was again, that's when it really started to open my mind about this stuff. It's like a classic be Bob Geldof does Live Aid. He still says he needs the money because people are still starving. The population of Ethiopia and Somalia and Eritrea are twice what they were back in 1985. So where are all these starving people? They've obviously doubled it. They doubled their population, and that doesn't include the ones who've emigrated abroad. And this is like, we're supposed, if you ask these questions like, how dare you? How dare you? You wicked person. And, it's something something we have to live with. But it's like, see, I think when you go into the world of the Anvil of the Psyche and this kind of thing, and even Matthias Desmet's book, it gives you tremendous self-confidence because the more you're less likely to be suckered in, the better you feel about yourself as a person overall. You do. It's definitely true. And you would say, like, you look at some of the absurd photographs of people putting water, putting plastic buckets and bags over their head during the Rona, or dressing up like they were going into plutonium, where there was plutonium. And you think to yourself, I didn't fall for that because not that I'm better, it's because, than them people. It's just that I now have the tools in my psyche not to fall for it. And this is not just learning information for the sake of it. This is information that can actually make your life infinitely better because you're not falling into these states of terror or mass hysteria that others do, or wasted emotions on things that you can't possibly change. And I see that a lot here in Ireland with the immigration crisis thing. I have to constantly look at, yeah, it's a real thing. It's causing problems. But I see people that I say to myself, you should really learn to put the brakes on. It's overcoming you, and it's not healthy at this point. I don't mean they're being racist or anything. I just mean it's just they're getting too absorbed in it. And even though their hearts are in the right place and they mean well, there's a point where you realize I can't do this. I can't change this. It's like the whole thing of a failing relationship. There's a point where someone says, I can't change. I'm out. I'm gone. You know, we've got to be like that in so many things in life. And this is why they've made an industry out of virtue and virtue signaling, because the more they make a people addicted to virtue signaling, the more they normalize association with these concepts they invented, like Black Lives Matter. But they also make it harder for people to say, I couldn't give a fuck. I couldn't give a fuck. You know, and but the great thing is that when you say I couldn't give a shit or couldn't give a fuck, you feel instantly liberated. It's an amazing thing. And suddenly all this stuff is not a part of you anymore. Now, it doesn't mean you don't care, you're not interested, you're not paying attention. It means you're not emotionally wrapped up in it to the point where it's impacting upon your quality of life. And that's the thing people always have to look out for, that the quality of your life must never be impacted upon by external things that you can't fundamentally change beyond small localized things.
Yeah, when you're sitting on a plane and the air hostesses, it's usually ladies, not always, are going through the safety measures, you know, what to do in the event of an emergency. With the oxygen mask that we're advised will drop down when needed, you're told this information, but you can also read it. Just make sure that you secure your oxygen mask, your own, before trying to help anyone else. So
Yeah.
the lesson from that is look after yourself. You know, if you don't love yourself, how can you love anyone else? If you don't secure your own oxygen mask, if you don't take care of that business, how can you expect to help anyone else? And you see a lot of people, we've been talking about when charities go wrong sort of thing, but you see it in modern movements that have particularly gained a lot of traction post-pandemic, you know, Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, these kind of death cults who want to kill the society that they're entirely a product of and dependent on, doing this stuff at the cost of their own personal relationships, their own mental and physical well-being. You know, we've all known people who've been destroyed by pursuing some of these arcane, abstruse, so-called charitable goals. You know, people who've literally, you know, gone to the wall. You know, they've died on that hill. You know, on that cross of like, you know, trying to do this greater good thing. All the while they're just like rotting. You know, and then their own like personal lives are a disaster.
Yeah, I know loads of communists have committed suicide. Like, you know, well, and these are fellas that had like wives and kids, but they got so caught up in the whole thing that communism was the answer, and they devolved into this sort of like intellectual, you know, version of like Marxist theory, that they, you know, that was the answer. And when things didn't get better, they literally killed themselves. Like the suicide rate among communists is absolutely enormous. It's as bad as atheists. And you see that a lot of atheists, they will go to they will traumatize themselves trying to justify that there is no spiritual world. When it would just be easier for them to say, well, if people want to believe that, leave them alone. You know, none of my business really. And but you see them, they go nuts. I mean, I can remember like someone having an argument, well, an argument, a debate with one of them once, and they said, look at these people, these that do these they don't do seances. What's the one they do a big seance when they do an audience, like where they pretend that the cold readings thing, or whatever it's called, and and they say, you know, telling people that their mother is just contacted from the dead, it's evil. And I said, well, there's two ways to look at it. Even if it's not true, if that person does believe that that was their mother saying, don't worry about it and get on with your life, and they do get over the grieving and get on with their life, is that evil? Is that bad? Because they've helped somebody, you know, ultimately. Oh no, because the spiritual world doesn't exist. And they don't know that, you know, this kind of thing as well. That's another thing that the Anvil of the Psyche does. When you when you these extraneous influences not only rob yourself from your own destiny, but they rob you of your spiritual destiny, because they don't want you working on that. That's the one they really don't want you working on, because that's the one that can actually affect the reality around you to the point where they can't affect you anymore. That's such a massive one. This is why, you know, the first prohibition of both in the biggest prohibition in the Abrahamic religions. It's not blasphemy, it's magic and sorcery. This is why when the Christians took over the Roman Empire, the first thing they did was ban sorceries and magic, because they knew that divination, because they knew that whatever it was about these things, they did allow people to hack the software of reality to do things that were the impossible, and that meant that their power structure would be then affected by this, and that's this is why we have a whole industry of, like, not so much now, but like the Dawkins, but it goes on now with Brian Cox and people like that, and Neil deGrasse Tyson and all these kinds of people, where there's no such thing as a spiritual dynamic. And it's all designed to stop you from finding out that there actually is. This is ultimately, we're not having a conversation here about politics or mind control. Like at the beginning, I said, what was the book really about? At the end of the day, it's a spiritual book when you think about it, a spiritual concept.
Yeah, and this is a spiritual reality, and in terms of, if you want to use it as reality in air quotes, chances are that my beloved phrase, the 3 dimensions, 5 sense reality that you and I are sharing right now, and the people watching this is just the tiniest sliver of what actually is. So, and it's those non-material dimensions I mentioned earlier about with 9/11, with the pandemic, with all these events being like an iceberg and most of the action is under the surface. That is really what we're talking about. And I think ultimately, when you look at, how you presented it in the book, the mass media matrix, 24/7 saturation in this information, this junk, and this actual worse than junk poison, that's a spiritual battle that we're really engaged in. And this is something that's come up again and again in in talks and presentations and videos and interviews that you've been part of, and myself likewise. Well, I guess closing up for today, it'd be good to end on a positive note. And I think that something that you and I and a lot of other people in the tribe and in our respective audiences have been aware of and talking about stems from the areas of what you've termed a wave function collapse, which is borrowed from quantum science, quantum physics, and the realms of hauntology and stuff. And there's a lot of in our shared sort of social media groups, there's been a lot of posts and conversations around all of this and observations about things taking place in the world out there that appear to reflect, a non-physical or a spiritual reality. Even really, really simple things, cultural markers. Those are the things that I think that those of us interested in pop culture tend to really notice and resonate with and kind of see a message in, if you know what I mean. Whether it's like the resurgence in vinyl sales that we've seen, let's face it, probably over the best part of 20 years now, in terms of music, to like a resurgence in interest in CB radio, citizen band radio.
Yep.
It's all sorts of historical things that are kind of making their presence felt in one way or another. And it's a really interesting series of trends, I think. And there's a reason why we're cognizant of this and observing it, and where it's going and what it might be saying about the wider culture and society.
Yeah, well, back to your crab in the train station at the beginning. Synchronicities remind you that help is available. That this is not a battle you're fighting alone. The universal, the God force, the Godheads, whatever, they're noticing that you're in the game in a different way now, and they're offering signs, and that's the language they use: symbols, signs, synchronicities, because they exist before the human vocal cords even existed, and that's how they communicate to us. And I think 2025. I mean, the wave function collapse, I think, will really kick in this year. Well, it's this year when this is being broadcast. I think something remarkable is remarkable things will unfold. And I like to think that I wrote Anvil, the Psyche, and a lot of my other stuff as a guidebook to help people observe it and take it rather than see it as something overwhelming, but to behold it from the front row seat in the theater. That's the way I would like to think about it.
Precisely. Well, as mentioned at the top of the hour, if people are not able to, or would rather not pay the inflated prices to get hold of a physical copy of the Anvil, the Psyche. If they go to your Substack, they can grab it there. It's not a particularly long book, so it's not an onerous, download or anything like that, and they can check it out and really see, as I say, how on the crest of a wave you were in terms of anticipating, technological and cultural developments. Remember, folks, I've got a signed, mint, pristine copy of the Anvil Psyche to give away to one of you. If you want to drop an email to legalizefreedom@yahoo.com, just stick Anvil Psyche, Thomas Sheridan, anything you like in the subject line. You don't have to have anything in the body of the email. And in a couple of weeks, whatever, I'll draw a name at random and get your postage details and send that book out to you. It's a lovely physical thing to have, a rarity, a collectible going forward, signed by Thomas. I'll do a couple of, just decided off the top of my head, I'll do a couple of runner-up prizes as well. Annual subscription to Legalize Freedom. That will give you 100% access to all the content for a full 12 months. So yeah, that's about that. So before we sign off, Thomas, tell folks the URL of your Substack, anything else that you might want to share. I know you're as busy as ever. Me and Sarah doing your shows together, and you've got your new Not Quite the Witching Hour, churning out content of high quality at a rate that most of us can only aspire to. So just anything you'd like to share with viewers?
Well, firstly, let me wish a happy 2025 to yourself and your viewers and everyone watching this. I think, thanks for everyone. I mean, when I think back, that book was 12 years ago now. Thanks to you, like yourself and others who are still in the conversation with me after all these years. And, I do appreciate that greatly. But yeah, I mean, it's Thomas Sheridan at Substack, and it's our different levels of archetypes is the name of the actual blog, that whatever the title for all that stuff. You can find me easy enough on there. And Thomas Sheridan and Beyond Room 313 on YouTube, and there's also Focus on Sarah Mondaini's channel, and various other things here and there that go around. But yeah, I mean, I'm quite looking forward to 2025. I think it's going to be really interesting, and I think we're going to learn a lot. And again, I mean, it's one of these things. I really do believe that we were born for these times. We manifested, we reincarnated to witness all this stuff, and so that there's an element of privilege in that people should always remember, that you've been privileged to see these things and not let them destroy you.
Yeah, and my final thought would be the idea that you've mentioned, and we both alluded to several times, about people just trying to go along to get along. And if I just do the next thing that I'm told, everything will be all right. And they're asking us to do this, and just one more little thing, and everything will be all right. From a metaphysical, spiritual, and occult philosophy point of view, I don't think that's what this realm is about. Certainly, there's pleasure to be had and interesting experiences to be had, and there's suffering as well. That's just baked into the cake. But I don't think that our incarnation here on Earth at this time, whether we've been here before or not, is about just having a good time and just cutting the lawn on Sunday afternoon and 2.6 kids and a new car every couple of years and a sofa and a hot holiday in Alicante. That might be what some people aspire to. I don't think that's what it's about. I think this is meant to be fucking rough, with a few diamonds.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's meant to be a challenge, and that's where creation comes from. The thing is that avoid going over Dracula's threshold if you can help it. But if you're going to go over his threshold, make sure you have a bulb of garlic in your pocket. That's the way I would see it. It's supposed to be a challenge, but it's also supposed to be a challenge that you rise to.
Splendid. Well, thanks again, Thomas, and no doubt we'll hook up again some form or another during the forthcoming year, 2025.
Thank you very much, Greg.
LegalizeFreedom.com